Pleural disease. The normal pleural space has only a few millimeters of liquid, which helps lubricate the normal to and from motion of the lungs during breathing. Fluid air and particles can move into the pleural space from different parts of the body because of its low pressure and its ability to hold large amounts of liquid. Pleural effusion or pneumothorax can lead to partial or complete compression of the lung.
Pleural cavity and pleura. Lungs are covered by a double-layered membrane known as pleura. Pleura is sort of wrapped around each lung on all sides, and each lung has its own pleura. The outer layer of pleura is known as parietal pleura and is attached to chest wall, versus visceral pleura, which is the inner layer, is attached to lungs itself. The thin space between two layers is known as pleural space or pleural cavity, and a small amount of fluid is always present in pleural space, which works as a lubricant to save lungs from injury during inspiration and expiration. Pleural effusion is a condition when excess fluid is accumulated between pleural layers, also known as pleural space or pleural cavity. It compromises breathing because lungs cannot completely expand during inspiration. Pleural effusion can accumulate as a result of a number of conditions like heart failure and lung infections. On the other hand, pneumothorax is a condition when air enters into pleural cavity as a result of trauma, for example, a stab wound or injury to ribs or any other underlying lung condition. As a result of pressure built up, lung actually collapses and can become non-functional. Sometimes puncture in pleura can often act like a valve. So with every breath, air goes into the pleural space and lungs collapses further. Not only lung collapses, but also starts putting pressure on heart and major vessels here, and the condition is known as tension pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax can potentially be life-threatening. Hemothorax is a condition when blood enters into pleural cavity, usually as a result of trauma or injury. These are the references, and the lecture is prepared for www.academyofprofessionals.com.
Applications in medicine. In 1979, film icon Steve McQueen was diagnosed with mesothelioma at the age of 49, after complaining to his doctor of chronic cough and shortness of breath with exertion. He was told the cause of the disease was his exposure to asbestos as a young man working in construction and as a merchant marine. Asbestos insulation was used extensively in ships at that time, and he recalled occasions when the air was clouded with asbestos dust and he cleaned ship's engine room after pipe installation.
Pleural refers to the space between the chest cavity and the lungs, and effusion refers to a collection of fluid. So a pleural effusion is when a disease process causes fluid to start to collect in the pleural space, which can sometimes restrict lung expansion. Now, the pleural cavity or pleural space lies between the parietal pleura, which is stuck to the chest wall, and the visceral pleura, which is stuck to the lungs. Because the lungs fit snugly inside the chest cavity, the visceral and parietal pleura lie right next to each other, and the very, very thin space between them contains a layer of fluid that acts as lubrication to allow the lungs to slide back and forth as they expand and contract. This pleural fluid is similar to interstitial fluid, and is made slippery by proteins like albumin. It's so similar to interstitial fluid because it essentially is interstitial fluid. There's always a tiny bit of plasma that leaks out of capillaries and gets into the interstitial space. And since these capillaries are so close to the edge of the pleural space, that fluid makes its way into that space and collects there. If there were no way out of the pleural space, then it would just fill up with fluid. But fortunately, there are lymphatic vessels in the pleura that drain the fluid away and deliver it back into the circulatory system. A pleural effusion is when there's excess fluid in the pleural space, either because too much pleural fluid is produced by the body, which could be due to a transudative or exudative effusion, or because the lymphatics can't effectively drain away the fluid, called a lymphatic effusion. A transudative pleural effusion happens when too much fluid starts to leave the capillaries, either because of increased hydrostatic pressure or decreased oncotic pressure in the blood vessels. Hydrostatic pressure is what we normally think of as blood pressure. It's the force that blood exerts on the walls of the blood vessel, and can be thought of as a pushing force. A common cause of increased hydrostatic pressure in the lung capillaries is heart failure. That's because when the heart can't effectively pump blood to the body, it backs up into the pulmonary vessels and causes the blood pressure in those vessels to rise. This high pressure forces fluid out of the capillaries and into the pleural space. Oncotic pressure results from the inability of solutes like large proteins, like for example albumin, to move across through the capillary. By osmosis, I'm talking about the process, not the company, fluid moves from areas of low solute concentrations to high solute concentration. Fluid therefore flows out of the capillaries and leaks into the pleural space when there's a decreased oncotic pressure in the blood vessels. Two causes of low oncotic pressure are cirrhosis, where the liver makes fewer proteins, and nephrotic syndrome, where proteins are lost in the urine. An exudative pleural effusion is due to inflammation of the pulmonary capillaries, which makes them a lot more leaky. The larger spaces between endothelial cells allows fluid, immune cells, and large proteins like lactate dehydrogenase, or LDH, which is found in all cells, to leak out of the capillaries. The causes of this, though, can vary, and can include things like trauma, malignancy, an inflammatory condition like lupus, or an infection like pneumonia. If the underlying reason is an infection, like a bacterial or mycobacterial infection, then it's also possible for that infection to spread into the pleural space, which is a walled-off space, kind of like an enormous abscess. Just like an abscess, the infected pleural space can develop fibrinous walls and have loculations. Finally, there can be a lymphatic pleural effusion, called a chylothorax. In a chylothorax, the thoracic duct is disrupted, and lymphatic fluid accumulates in the pleural space. The most common cause of chylothorax is when the thoracic duct accidentally gets damaged during a thoracic surgery. But it can also be caused by tumors in the mediastinum that press up against the thoracic duct and compress it shut. Symptoms of a pleural effusion mostly depend on its size. A small effusion might go unnoticed, whereas a large one might cause pain while inhaling, called pleurisy, as well as shortness of breath, and might be more obvious only when lying down flat. Classically, a pleural
Pros. Even though pleural diseases are highly risky, it takes a lot of time for the disease to manifest, so there's time to treat the disease before it's too late. Cons. It's a real serious problem that can cause the death of the patient if left untreated.
During normal respiration, the lungs expand and contract within the chest cavity. The lungs are encased by 2 layers of tissue, similar to a fist that has been pushed into a balloon. The space between the layers, called the pleural cavity, is lubricated so that the lungs can slide comfortably across the chest wall. If air enters the space, it is referred to as a pneumothorax. One type of pneumothorax, called a traumatic pneumothorax, can be caused by injury to the chest. A blunt or penetrating chest injury can cause a small tear on the surface of the lung, allowing air to enter the pleural cavity and to become trapped. The pocket of air produces excessive pressure on the lung, causing it to collapse. A spontaneous pneumothorax occurs without injury as a result of certain lung diseases, such as asthma, emphysema, or COPD. Small air-filled sacs called blebs can form on the lungs. If the blebs rupture, they can release air into the pleural cavity. Pressure from the trapped air causes the lung to collapse. However, a spontaneous pneumothorax can also develop in a person with no obvious risk factors or disease. This condition is more common in smokers and in men between the ages of 20 and 40. A tension pneumothorax is a serious complication that can develop with any pneumothorax. If the pocket of trapped air cannot escape, it continues to grow. The increased pressure in the pleural cavity can push the heart and major blood vessels to the other side of the chest. When this shift takes place, it causes a significant drop in blood pressure. This is a life-threatening condition that requires immediate medical attention.
Issue applied in Ecuador. In Ecuador, pleural diseases such as pneumothorax are very common, caused by traumas. On the other hand, pleural effusion and development of mesothelioma are less frequent.
Mesothelioma is an aggressive cancer that attacks the mesothelium, which is a thin membrane made of epithelial cells that lines all of the body's organs, as well as body spaces like the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Mesothelioma most often develops in the lining of the lungs and pleural cavity, and is well known for its association with the carcinogen asbestos. In fact, the late Hollywood actor Steve McQueen's known for having developed mesothelioma after years of asbestos exposure while in the military. That being said, the vast majority of mesothelioma cases stem from asbestos exposure. Asbestos is a mineral that was widely used as construction material in everything from paint to insulation to roofing tiles, because it has strong fibers that were resistant to fire and served as good insulation. Asbestos fibers are jagged in shape and extremely tiny, about 500 times finer than a human hair. If those tiny asbestos fibers get inhaled over time, they make their way into the interstitial space of the lungs and then slowly make their way over to the epithelial cells of the visceral or parietal pleura, both of which are layers of the mesothelium. The microscopic, jagged asbestos fibers are not metabolized or removed from the lungs. So, unlike smoking, whose risk gets lower after you quit, the risk from asbestos exposure stays with you for life. The presence of these fibers leads to an inflammatory response and DNA damage. Eventually, mutations can arise that lead to these epithelial cells dividing uncontrollably and turning into a tumor. Over time, small cancerous growths called mesothelial plaques start to cover the visceral pleura over the lungs, as well as the parietal pleura under the chest wall. Interestingly, these growths start to express a lot of calretinin, a calcium binding protein involved in regulating calcium levels within the cell. And this is something that helps distinguish mesotheliomas from other types of tumors. In addition to affecting the lungs and pleural lining, asbestos fibers can also end up in the stomach if saliva containing the material or mucus from the airways is swallowed. Research is also being done to find out whether asbestos fibers are capable of traveling through the lymphatic system. Because asbestos fibers affect epithelial cells, they can cause mesothelioma in nearly any of the body's internal organs, but it's most commonly found in the lungs and abdominal organs, like the liver, the spleen, and the bowel, or in very rare cases, the pericardium lining of the heart and the testes. Symptoms of mesothelioma affecting the lungs or parietal pleura include chest pain, shortness of breath, pleural effusions, and if the tumor invades into a blood vessel, it can result in bloody sputum. Occasionally, a mesothelioma can also destroy the lung tissue between the bronchial tree and the pleural space, leading to a pneumothorax, which is air in the pleural space. Diagnosing a mesothelioma typically starts with a chest X-ray or CT scan, with key findings being pleural thickening as well as pleural effusion or pneumothorax. Ultimately, though, the diagnosis is made with a biopsy of the tumor. In suspected cases of mesothelioma, the tissue sample can be immunostained with an antibody that reacts with the protein calretinin, and this gives the cytoplasm and nuclei of the cancerous cells a distinctive fried egg shape. Unfortunately, the prognosis for mesothelioma is poor, unless it's caught early. This is because the cancer is extremely resilient and has typically spread to multiple organs by the time it's detected. Treatment depends heavily on the stage of the disease, and usually combines surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. Alright, as a quick recap,